Hey everyone, this is Danielle, and I wanted to record a brief video on the annotated bibliography, which is something that you kind of got a heads up last module, but it's due this module in Module 7. So it sometimes is the first time students have done an annotated bibliography. There may be instances where students have done it before, but I did want to go ahead and address it. So because if it's your first time, or even if you've done one before, it's not the most standard of genres when it comes to writing and research. So I just wanted to go through some, this is what it looks like. These are things that you want to make sure you're doing versus things you aren't doing. And so you can see in front of me, I've got pulled up the annotated bibliography assignment. And it gives you both the research paper instructions, because as this explanation includes, it explains that, research, I don't think it explicitly states it, but research is part of the pre-writing practice, or when we talk about writing as a process, pre-writing is one of the major parts of pre-writing, because we can't write, as particularly within a research paper, until we understand what other people are saying about a conversation. So, and it helps us to gain a broader view and broader understanding of the various arguments and claims and things that people are saying, very similar to the pieces of critical, they're not excerpts, but the essays that you read for Twain, the people who were talking about Twain, that was part of Module 6 discussion assignments. So, those types of perspectives where people are making arguments about a text are allowing people to, as an example, to gain a better understanding of different conversations that are taking place about a text, and in this case, a literary text. And literary texts are usually always, I would say 99.9% of the time, they're making a case for something. They're making an argument, oftentimes multiple arguments, and it comes down to, what does the text mean? What does it, what is its commentary? What is its commentary through this lens versus this lens? And so, and that's why secondary sources exist. So when I talk about primary sources, I'm talking about the actual texts that you read for the class. So a primary source is the original artifact. A primary source can also be a painting, a song. It can be, a sculpture that somebody created. It can be an historical document, and we've read some historical documents in this text as well. So the primary source is the original source, and the original source has its own claims, its own rhetorical situations, et cetera, but there are also secondary sources, and secondary sources are those sources like you read about Mark Twain, and Huckleberry Finn. Secondary sources are sources that speak to or speak about the primary sources. They are making claims about something. They're saying, in particular in the world of the humanities, and this happens in other disciplines as well, but they're ultimately saying, I'm going to take this text and I'm going to make an argument about it. Whether or not we agree or disagree with that argument is up to us. And the most important thing always, whether we're bringing in outside sources, and by outside sources I mean secondary sources, the most important thing is to always be able to ground whatever it is you're saying in the primary source text, which means quoting directly, which is why, if you're getting tired of me talking about evidence integration and quoting directly, There's a reason why I'm doing that, and that's because that's the most important thing. You can't say something or make a claim about something unless you point to the text and say, this is what it says in the text here, and this is how it can be interpreted, and I can interpret it because reason, reason, reason. So there's always these kind of justifications that we have to make, and we have to ground it in actual evidence from the text. So you have the research paper instructions because the research that you're doing, as I noted, as part of, for the annotated bib, is part of the pre-writing practice. Although research is something, and this goes for any kind of pre-writing, research is something that we return to again and again and again. And that's very natural and normal in the writing process. And that's because you might firstly identify these sources, but as you're writing, you might say, actually, as I'm looking at this source, it's actually not working. Or you might say something like, I think I need another source or a source that talks about X, right? So you might realize that you need an additional source or sources to include, or you might realize that one or more of the sources that you originally chose, for example, in your annotated bibliography, aren't going to do the work that they need to do to support your ultimate argument and the ultimate purpose, the rhetorical purpose of the essay. So this is part of pre-writing, but because writing is recursive, meaning it's something that's always cyclical, we're always going through, where we start with pre-writing, but we always return to pre-writing, or at least in best practices. And then you have the annotated bibliography document here, which takes you through the assignment in more detail. So it explains, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. It explains, what it actually is an annotated bibliography, and it says here, right, it's a collection of sources about a specific topic. It typically includes a citation, and then followed by what's called an annotation. Annotation, the word, comes from the Latin annotare, which means to take additional notes. So if you've ever read a book or an article, whether it's hard copy or soft copy, meaning you actually have it in your hands or it's on a computer, and you have made notes in the margins, or if you're on a computer, you might highlight something and then make a note about it. You're annotating that document. So you're providing annotations because you're providing additional notes on something that you might want to return to later. Sometimes you don't know. And then this explains what the annotation for each source actually is. An annotation is comprised of two main rhetorical tasks: summary and evaluation. And you don't want to conflate or confuse the two or put them together. They're always separate. So the summary, right, it says here summary and then evaluation. And then this just notes that, annotations are written in narrative form, meaning not in a bullet point form. And just a quick, this is what summary is versus evaluation. Summary is a very objective. This article, I'm saying article, I already have notes where I say don't use the word article. Authors' names argue X. What is the argument of the source? How do they go about supporting their argument? And then what is the purpose of the source? And things like audience are important as well. It's just a very objective, this is what the source is. This is what it's arguing. This is how it's arguing it. This is the purpose for it. And this is who the audience is. This goes over the kind of general assignment criteria for the annotated bib. For the research paper, right, you want to select 2 works assigned in the class, in our class, that you want to write about for the research paper. And this is where students get a little mixed. I don't know what happens here. but there's a disconnect at some point with a number of students, because I've seen it many, many times, and I'll explain that in a second. And ultimately, so say I choose Thomas Paine, and for example, I'm just going to throw out Nathaniel Hawthorne as two examples. I have no idea why I want to talk about them. I'm just using them as examples. If I have Thomas Paine and Nathaniel Hawthorne, this says here, right? Locate 3 sources that deal with each of them. So I would be doing research on, or I would want to find 3 sources that talk about or provide some type of commentary on Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And then I would do the same thing for Nathaniel Hawthorne. I would want to find 3 secondary sources, through the Hunt Library databases that provide commentary or some type of argument about one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's short stories that we read. So maybe it's Young Goodman Brown, just as an example. This notes or reminds students that sources like Wikipedia, SparkNotes, LitCharts, all of these various things that exist on the internet, they don't count as sources at all. You should never cite them in your source. That's not to say you can't use them. When we talk about research, we talk about informal and formal research. So informal research is because research is part of the pre-writing process, we start with informal research, which is, hey, I'm going to look at, if I'm doing Thomas Paine and Nathaniel Hawthorne, what does Wikipedia say about Thomas Paine and Common Sense? What does it say about Young Goodman Brown? And then maybe I'd look at some other sources like SparkNotes or LitCharts or these various sources which are considered encyclopedic. Sometimes they're just considered, they're not credible. They're just sometimes what we call reference sources. And they're really, really helpful for, one, helping us to better understand the sources, meaning the primary sources. So Thomas Paine and Nathaniel Hawthorne in this case. And secondly, they're really helpful to give us a sense of what are some of the larger or more consistent conversations that are taking place around these sources. So, and sometimes, like, I'm a writer who oftentimes tends to want to blaze my own trail. So I'll be like, I'm aware of what everybody else is talking, but I want to focus on this. So if you hear another voice, I apologize. I'm on the Embry-Riddle campus right now. So these sources are helpful, but they aren't sources we ultimately want to use in our annotated bib or final research paper, because these sources work well at the level of informal research in the pre-writing process. They can help inform our ideas, and people look at things like LitCharts or SparkNotes or Wikipedia and they think, well, that's what it must be about. And it's like, no, these are also all biased sources as well. Not only are they not credible because they can be written by anybody, but they can also be biased. And I also read a lot of these too, to keep up on what people are saying about certain texts. And I just go in and I'm like, okay, I have a lot of issues with what SparkNotes or LitCharts or whatever it is saying or is making claims about these things. I don't think they're doing it in the best way, or actually they've incorrectly noted something, and that's because they're written by sometimes, maybe you have an undergraduate degree in literature or English, or maybe the requirements to be able to do things like that. Anybody can be a Wikipedia editor. I used to teach a Wikipedia project where my students would serve as Wikipedia editors. And it's a very interesting look into how that type of knowledge production takes place, or incorrect knowledge production. But same thing with things like SparkNotes, CliffNotes, LitCharts, et cetera. You have to have very basic credentials to be able to, write and submit things for these things. And then you have things like paper mills. I won't even get into things like Course Hero or the different paper mills that exist, where students upload their previous work, and it's like, I don't know that that's either a good way to, good place to look at things. All this to say, this is all part of the informal research process. Then you move to the formal research process, which is going to the Hunt library databases. And here there's even a recommendation for the Gale or the Modern Language Association International Bibliography databases. I'm a little bit hesitant. I don't necessarily agree with this because the MLA International Bib database is an incredibly powerful and important database, but it is mostly just a bunch of citations. And so whether or not you would actually have access to what's being listed is limited. So you can use it, but I would use it maybe as a last resort. That's kind of, I will often, when I start researching, I will start with the MLA International Bib as one of the databases that I use, and I'll also use it as a last resort. Like, I feel like I've exhausted my the various databases that I have access to. I'm going to go back to the MLA International Bib, and I actually want to see a bunch of citations that maybe are things that I don't have access to. I'm going to then contact a librarian at my university, and I'm going to see if I can't get access to those things. So I would recommend things also like Gale, but also JSTOR tends to be one of the best. I'll bring that up at the very end. And then this just notes that, because this is part of the pre-writing process, we don't necessarily use all of these sources in the research paper, but you do have to use at least 2 of them. So you want to make sure that they're good. As usual, you can choose between MLA or APA 7, and this gives you can use the handbook or the OWL at Purdue. Okay, so they give some examples here on this document of what an annotated bib might be formatted like. I did upload, and you also want to always pay attention to rubrics as well, because rubrics are also how I grade, and it's how I justify my grading. So it only has 3 rubric areas, and that's because there's 3 main parts to the annotated bib. One includes the sources themselves. The other is the summary part of the annotation, and the other is the evaluation part of the annotation. Oh, I did mention what the summary was, but I don't think I went over evaluation. Evaluation is then where you say, so summary, like I noted, is an objective. This is just what the this source is about. The evaluation is, here's how this source, it's more of what I think about this source without saying I think this about this source. You evaluate it, meaning, why is it credible? What is it going to ultimately, how is it going to help your paper? How do you anticipate what it says contributing to an idea that you want to explore in the paper? And taking into consideration things like, does it have any limitations that you'll have to address? If it's a counter argument source, which it's not unusual to bring in counter arguments, although you don't have to in this case, what is the counter argument it makes, and then how do you plan on refuting that counter argument? So that's evaluation. Evaluation, you can see, is one more point than summary, which I think is kind of quite funny. But evaluation tends to be, you want it to be a little bit longer. Like, the summary should not be very long, and then the evaluation should be a little bit longer than the summary. But ultimately, the annotations are not very long. When I used to teach annotations in a first year comp class, the annotations were 500 words each. So these are quite short annotations, especially for a 300 level class. So that being said, wrong thing. In modules, if you go to handouts and resources, I've got a couple things there. And I've got the 3-step model visual. I have the orphan and hit and run quotations document or handout. And then I have 2 annotated bib sample. I have one is without notes, and they are different. And then I have one with my notes. And I just added some notes to give you an idea of what is going through my head. So, and these are from a previous Humanities 310 course. So this one is using APA 7. They did forget the page number up here because you still need a cover page. And this is formatted without looking at the notes. Just note how it's formatted. So it's formatted correctly because they note the topic at the top. Everything is uniformly double spaced, which is how it should be. You can put a space like the annotated bib handout shows between each source if we want a reminder as to what that looks like. If we go to here, and if you note how you can do it this way. This is weird because I just taught an annotated bib in my English 123 class, and the instructions are different. So I'm like, what? So you can do it this way. It's fine. Note that the citations themselves are double spaced, but the annotations are not, and that's okay. You can do it that way. Oops, wrong thing. I have too many things open. As you can see, I have a lot of things open. So if we look at, this is the one where I have notes on it. This one is fully uniformly double spaced. This is how my English 123 students are taught how to do annotated bibs. You can do them like this as well. So the formatting, I'll leave it up to you. So long as the most important thing to double space are your actual citations. Because essentially all an annotated bibliography is a references page where between every citation, normally a references page would just be a list of citations, right? An annotated bib is just like a reference, like an advanced references page. It's here are all my citations, but between every citation, I have an annotation that includes some notes on this source. And the notes specifically are summary and evaluation. So you can see that gives a topic up front. This person is focusing on Twain and Hurston. But you can see it's citation, annotation, citation, annotation, citation, annotation, citation, annotation, citation, annotation, etc. This only has 5 sources on it, I believe, so they are actually missing a source, which is not uncommon. Like, I feel like there are some basic criteria. Like, I understand that annotated bibs can be a little bit kind of like strange in terms of the writing genre that it is. But there are just some basic criteria that students seem to commonly confuse that makes me confused because I don't know where the confusion is coming from. And nobody asks me any questions ever, so I don't know. So it's hard for me to gauge. So I'm left to just think, did they not understand the instructions? Were they confused? Were they just out of time? Were they lazy? Because students rarely reach out to me unless they have a late assignment. They're not, it's very rare that I get messages from students that are, can you help me understand this assignment? Am I doing it correctly? Those types of questions that instructors want, but we never got. I never got it in a face-to-face environment, and I don't get it in online. It's it doesn't matter. But regardless of that, it's there's 6 sources. So you need 6 sources hands down. 3 in this case, it would be 3 on Twain and 3 on Hurston. The other thing that students do a lot, and I tried to explicitly note in the announcement, and it's even when I put things in announcements, I know students, I see analytics of how many people read my announcements. I know students don't read them. But for example, in the most recent announcement I posted, I even I always say this, please note that the two primary sources you choose for your research, for example, in that the example that I was showing, that was Twain and Hurston. So the two primary sources, Twain and Hurston, right, and I try to explain it more, meaning the two texts you choose that we read in the course, do not count toward the 6 required sources and shouldn't at all be listed on the annotated bibliography. In the research paper, yes, you would cite them because you would be quoting from that person. The person would be quoting from Twain and Hurston. But in the annotated bib, it's because it's just a reference page and the primary sources are not considered part of the 6, there's no reason why those sources should be on the annotated bib at all. So, and I see a lot of times students will put, like, I would get Twain, M, Adventures of Huckleberry, and I'm like, no, that's a primary source. Why is that on here? Not to mention I mentioned it in my announcement. So you're not reading my announcements. You're not reading the instructions for the assignment. What are you doing? And I become very confused as an instructor. Or if I saw Hurston, comma, Z dot, H dot, their eyes were watching God. It's like, no, that's a primary source. So you don't want your primary sources on the annotated bib. The annotated bib is for your secondary sources. And so you can see here, these are secondary sources, right? This comes from the journal Comparative Literature and Culture. This is correctly cited. Some of the notes that I include here, right? I talk about how another common thing that students do, part of my reason in providing these comments are what I call part of cumulative feedback. And cumulative feedback is, I see these things very common and I've seen them for years and years and years. So I try to focus on that versus like something I might see on a more rare occasion, right? So articles don't make arguments, authors do, because it's not uncommon for us to want to say, even how I said it earlier, right? This article argues, it's like articles don't make arguments. Like if we think about the subject verb there, it doesn't make sense. So, and here I note, right, this is where the student states the argument, which you need to do in your summary, in the summary part of the annotation. And I'm referring, it's highlighted which part of the annotation that I'm looking at. I say this is where they state the argument. A quotation from the article that shows this as the argument would be more effective. That's me being nice. It is more effective. Would be the slightly more aggressive language there. Additionally, there is no explanation from the student as to how this is an argument. And then I say, so what if the self is not a predetermined entity? What is Bernard, the author, actually arguing about an unstable self, about how an unstable self functions in Zora Neale Hurston? I don't need to read the article to know that this is not the argument. I don't need to. If I understand that the title is The Cognitive Construction of the Self and Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and they present the argument as the argument being a cognitive model of self in which the self is not fixed or a predetermined entity, I know that that's not an argument, because that does not, it doesn't present an argumentative statement in response to the text, and that doesn't reflect how the title, how this would answer the title of this argument. And that's why we always like quotations in annotations, because you can just directly say, this is just the quotation. That is the argument. And even then, sometimes students get it wrong, because picking out arguments is not the easiest thing in the world. I understand that, especially in scholarly articles. So, and then I go on to make some notes about just the writing, the various kind of what they're doing in their summaries and evaluations. This is a good source, right? It's from the Journal of Ethics. That's a scholarly article, volume, issue, page range. DOI. This is all cited in APA 7. This is another scholarly journal, so this is a good source. This is, I did a lot down there. This is from ProQuest. Oh yeah, sorry, here it is, the Raritan. Yeah, that's the name of the scholarly journal. So down here, what I did is, if you look at what I did, I have track changes on this, is they had, and this isn't uncommon for students to do, is if they see that the source capitalizes the entire title, they'll do the same in the reference page. So I understand the kind of like the logic behind that, but we don't do that. So we have to follow APA's rules. So I went ahead and rewrote that title in what we use in APA reference citations, which is called sentence case. Whereas journal titles go in what we call title case. So I did change some things to try to make the citations correct, because I wanted you to have, here's what correct APA 7 citations look like that are actually good sources, and also here's some comments on what I think, excuse me, ultimately about, you know, I could say more, but I didn't want to overwhelm. And I say here, if you read through the students' annotations, you will see them using the same active verbs again and again. And then I try to point out that there's good repetition and bad repetition. I said the repeating of the same verbs over and over again suggests that the student does not have the vocabulary to offer variety in verb choices. You can just Google online list of active verbs and you'll get a ton of collated documents that provide a collated list of active verbs. One that's good to have for resumes, because you should always be using active verbs on resumes, but it's a good idea to understand what are active verbs and what do they look like. And I say it's always important to use the verb argues or arguing when directly referring to the argument of the article, because a lot of students will say like, this article explores, and it's like, there's a difference between arguing and exploring. So exploration is part of methodology. So that's part of, here's my argument, how am I going to support it? Well, I'm going to explore and analyze this particular thing as a means to support this argument. So that's ultimately my goal, or was my goal in providing these comments on here, was to show here's what good sources look like, even though there's only 5, and they're cited correctly. I had to change a little bit of them to make them be correct, but generally they were correct. Mostly they were correct. And here are some comments, excuse me, about their annotations ultimately. And just as the final thing, because I know this video is getting much longer than I anticipate, but that's everything in my life. If we go to the Hunt library, which I don't know, there it is. If you go to the Hunt library, I encourage you to go to research databases here. And this will give you an alphabetical or alphabetized list of the various databases that the Embry-Riddle has access to, has paid for subscriptions for. And I always, for literature, I recommend, if I know my alphabet, JSTOR here, which is a great place to start. I might post a video I have about navigating the library. I know there's other things that I've chatted with librarians when I need help finding things. They're incredibly helpful. But I have a video that I might post also that goes through navigating these databases. And if you want to look for any, like this is Literary Reference Center, or, you know, you want to just, you know, Academic One File is good. It's pretty general in its variety of sources, but JSTOR for literature, like for me as a librarian, when I do literature research, JSTOR is probably, if not that MLA International Bib, which is the one that provides the citations, JSTOR will be the first place I go. And that's because it provides, it's all scholarly. And, but the thing with JSTOR, and I go through this in more detail in the video that I made, is, let me log in there, is you always, if it's not already giving you, okay, I don't know what that is. If it's not already giving you the advanced search, always click the advanced search option, because this gives you the multiple boxes to search by. And you also want to make sure that you click on articles, because sometimes I'll get students who put in reviews, which means book reviews, or books. You don't want books. You don't want, so not only do you not want Wikipedia, LitChart, SparkNotes, reference sources as part of your 6 sources, you also don't want books, and you also don't want book reviews. So when you're in JSTOR or any other type of database, ensure that you're noting articles. Sometimes you don't have to say it, sometimes you do, but I definitely recommend getting used to JSTOR, Academic One File, the MLA International Bib. Again, I might use it as a last resort, because you may not have access to the sources. You can, sometimes it's recommended, you know, the most recent research. So you can say, like, I want research from 2010 to 2020. And then if that were to only give me, if that date restriction, or 2023, right? If that date restriction were, you know, only gave me like 5 sources or 20 sources or 60 sources, I might say, okay, let me back it up a little. Let me go from 2000 to 2023. But more recent research is usually considered more credible. But anyways, that's all I want to go over for now. I'll provide some additional research information in terms of like the video I have and things like that. But I'm trying to find, yeah, here's where we are. But other than that, that's all I've got to say. If you have any questions as you're working on your annotated bib and research in the Hunt Library, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask me any questions.